On May 8, 1945, as Victory in Europe Day dawned, the Allied world erupted in celebration. From the hallowed streets of London and Paris to the bustling avenues of New York, church bells pealed jubilantly, and flags fluttered in a triumphant display of relief. Yet, thousands of miles away, nestled within the quiet farmlands of Iowa, Kansas, and Texas, the war's end was heralded in a starkly different manner. Inside makeshift camps, surrounded by the stark reality of barbed wire, there were no champagne toasts or grand parades. Instead, American officers delivered a brief, chilling announcement. Standing before their assembled prisoners, men and women alike, they uttered four simple words: "You can go home." These words should have resonated like salvation, the long-awaited promise of liberation. Instead, in that immediate instant, the silence that followed the pronouncement carried a weight far stranger than celebration. The German women, many in their 20s and some older, exchanged glances, their eyes cast downward. A few subtly shook their heads, whispering softly in their native tongue, a quiet, almost imperceptible refusal. They had been brought across the vast ocean under a cloud of suspicion and fear. Some had served as auxiliaries in the Luftwaffe Communications Corps, others as nurses who followed the Wehrmacht, and a few were simply caught in the maelstrom of war, swept into captivity for working too close to the wrong military unit. These were women who had once believed they would face brutal cruelty if captured by the enemy. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as savage brutes, destroyers, men utterly devoid of mercy. The transatlantic voyage itself, undertaken in utilitarian gray troop ships, had been an agonizing journey steeped in dread. Yet, the ensuing months had meticulously dismantled every one of their expectations. The camps in the American Midwest, while far from opulent palaces, were remarkably orderly, impeccably clean, and, most astonishingly, abundantly supplied with food. One young prisoner, barely older than 22, had scrawled a telling note into her battered notebook. "They feed us peanut butter, sticky, strange, but rich. I cannot stop eating it." Her thin, jagged handwriting conveyed a sense of profound astonishment rather than simple gratitude, as though even experiencing delight was a kind of betrayal to the devastated world she had left behind. Another woman, formerly a typist in a Luftwaffe office, later confided to a Red Cross interviewer that she had received new shoes upon her arrival, a luxury she hadn't owned since 1941. These were seemingly minor comforts, but in wartime Europe, where families routinely boiled nettles for soup and shoes were patched until utterly disintegrated, such provisions were luxuries beyond imagination. When the officers delivered their announcement on that crisp spring morning, many anticipated an eruption of unbridled joy. Instead, the women's subdued reaction profoundly unsettled them. A captain stationed in Texas later recounted, "I thought they would run to the gate." While some women did weep, their tears were not born of happiness. They stemmed from a deeper, heavier emotion, a profound sense of dread. For these women, the concept of going home meant stepping back into a world that had all but ceased to exist. Letters, carefully smuggled past censors, spoke of cities reduced to rubble, relatives who had vanished, and towns arbitrarily carved into occupation zones. One particularly harrowing note, read aloud by a trembling 26-year-old in the barracks, detailed her mother starving in Hamburg and her brother missing in Russia. Going home, therefore, no longer signified a joyful reunion. It promised only rubble, pervasive hunger, and paralyzing fear. The stark contradiction between the officer's hopeful pronouncement, "You can go home," and the quiet refusal that followed revealed a truth both sides initially struggled to comprehend. These women, captives in a foreign land, had paradoxically begun to perceive their very captivity as a form of safety. Behind the wire, they were indeed watched, but they were also sheltered, their bellies consistently filled, and their dignity at times unexpectedly restored. They were even permitted to work. In Kansas, local farm families initially regarded lines of German women marching into the fields to harvest sugar beets with profound suspicion. However, this suspicion gradually dissipated as the women's laughter carried on the wind. Their broken English jokes about America having more corn than soldiers, revealing a resilient humor. Even amidst their confinement, a flicker of joy had returned to them. The American guards, too, were not oblivious to this profound transformation. A sergeant in Iowa later admitted, "They looked so young. You forgot they were the enemy." At night, the melancholic strains of music drifted from the barracks. Accordions, carried all the way from Europe, filling the still air above the prairie. For those moments, the sound was neither German nor American. It was simply human, and within that shared humanity, something complicated and profound began to take root. Nonetheless, the orders remained unequivocally clear. The Geneva Convention mandated repatriation. America harbored no intention of holding its prisoners, especially women, any longer than absolutely necessary. But what the officers could not have anticipated was the fierce resistance to freedom itself. One lieutenant in Texas, flustered by the sight of prisoners openly weeping at his announcement, reiterated the words, as if repeating them might somehow alter their meaning. "You can go home," he insisted. Yet, a woman standing at the front of the group shook her head, her halting English cutting through the air. "Home? No home left." It was a devastating sentence that shattered every illusion. America could indeed open the gates, but what lay beyond them was not a homeland waiting with open arms. It was a desolate expanse of ruins. In the Soviet zone, grim rumors of mass assaults and atrocities spread through the camps like wildfire. Even in the Western zones, chronic food shortages plagued the populace. Cities stood as blackened skeletons, and millions wandered as desperate displaced persons. To leave the relative safety of a camp in Iowa for Bremen or Dresden was not liberation. It was an expulsion into absolute nothingness. The sheer strangeness of the moment is almost impossible to overstate. Officers, their uniforms dusty from long service, stood bewildered, their orders unambiguous, while before them stood women who, by all accounts, should have eagerly rushed to board trains eastward. Instead, they pleaded to remain behind the very barbed wire of their conquerors. The irony was sharp enough to sting. America, once demonized as a monstrous entity in Nazi propaganda, had, for these women, become the only refuge they trusted. A young guard, barely 19, later articulated this paradox in a letter home. "I never thought the enemy would ask me to keep them prisoners, but some of the girls cry when they think of going back. They are safer here than free out there." He confessed that the sight haunted him. War had indeed turned the world upside down, and here was its undeniable proof. Captivity desired, freedom feared. This poignant scene unfolded in camp after camp across the American heartland. Not all resisted. Some were, understandably, desperate to discover what remained of their families and homes. But enough women begged to stay that the officers began to grasp the profound depth of Europe's devastation. Each petition, each quiet refusal, was less about residual loyalty to Germany and more about an overwhelming terror of what Germany had become. The women were not clinging to their captors. They were clinging to the last place where life felt remotely bearable. When the announcement concluded and the officers dismissed them, the women did not scatter with excitement. They returned to their barracks slowly, subdued, carrying questions heavier than the packs they had once hauled across Europe. That night, lights burned late. Some meticulously penned letters, asking relatives if a roof still existed for them to return to. Others simply sat in profound silence, staring at the wooden walls as if trying to measure the immeasurable distance between barbed wire and genuine freedom. And so began a story not of liberation in the traditional sense, but of an unexpected internal conflict, the desire to remain in captivity, to trade a ruined homeland for the uneasy safety of a foreign prison. The officers had delivered their line, "You can go home," but for many of these women, the phrase carried no promise, only crushing dread. In the weeks that followed, petitions would be drafted, arguments made, and tears shed. The world expected prisoners to yearn for release, but the reality was far stranger. The gates stood open, and yet many chose to stay. And what came next would astonish even the officers themselves. The camps where these German women lived were certainly never designed to be permanent homes. Yet, for many, They became something closer to stability than anything awaiting them across the vast ocean. Wooden barracks, arranged in neat rows, stood starkly against the endless horizons of the American Midwest. Mornings commenced with the clang of a bell, the comforting aroma of boiled coffee drifting from the guards' quarters, and the soft shuffle of boots on gravel as prisoners filed into their work details. To outsiders, it undeniably looked like captivity. To the women inside, however, it felt strangely like survival. Daily life unfolded in rhythms that seemed entirely detached from the ongoing war. In Texas, women rose early to peel mountains of potatoes in camp kitchens, the thick scent of starch hanging heavy in the humid air. In Iowa, they toiled on farms under armed supervision, bending over seemingly endless fields of corn and sugar beets, their dresses clinging with sweat, the fierce sun beating down on their backs. American families occasionally observed from a distance, weary eyes peering from porches, half expecting defiance or sabotage. What they witnessed instead was laughter carried on the wind, women joking in German, sometimes even daring to mimic the English words they overheard. A farmer once told a guard, half in jest, "If they keep working like this, I'll hire them after the war." Small, unofficial acts of kindness began to subtly infiltrate the rigid boundaries. A guard in Kansas slipped an apple to a prisoner during a long day in the field. She bit into it slowly, savoring the crisp sweetness, and later recorded in her diary, "It tasted of peace." Another young woman, formerly a typist in Stuttgart, vividly recalled the first time she entered an American grocery store under guard escort. Rows of gleaming canned goods under electric light, soaps stacked in meticulous towers, fabrics folded in vibrant rainbow colors. "I thought it was a dream," she confessed years later. To see so much of everything, the sheer abundance mocked the stark memories of her homeland, where long queues snaked around rubble-strewn streets for mere ounces of flour. This stark contrast between expectation and reality sharpened with each passing month. The women had been indoctrinated by Nazi propaganda that American imprisonment meant brutality, hunger, perhaps even certain death. Instead, they found themselves receiving 3 meals a day, sometimes amounting to as much as 3,200 calories, according to Red Cross reports. This was significantly more than most civilians in Germany consumed during those final years of the war, when rations had shriveled to near starvation. Meat regularly appeared on their plates, bread was soft and white, and for the first time in years, they could wash their hair with actual soap. The profound irony was certainly not lost on them. One woman remarked to her Barak mates that she had been more nourished behind barbed wire than she ever had been in her own home. The Americans, too, gradually adjusted their perceptions. At first, suspicion weighed heavily. To many guards, a German uniform, even on a woman, carried the same inherent stain as a weapon. But gradually, distance yielded to recognition. They observed the fatigue etched into the women's faces, the visible longing when letters arrived from overseas, the way they clutched worn, soft-edged photographs of family. A sergeant in Oklahoma remembered thinking, "They look no older than my sister. How could I call them enemy?" The lines blurred, though never officially acknowledged. Music became an unexpected bridge across the divide. At night, the women would gather in their barracks, one playing an accordion, another tapping a rhythm on the wooden frame of a bed. Songs filled the air, sometimes melancholic German folk tunes, sometimes cherished hymns remembered from childhood. Guards would pause in their patrols, listening as the melancholy notes drifted into the prairie night. For the women, it was a vital way of keeping their humanity intact, a poignant reminder that beyond the barbed wire, life still possessed a melody. Of course, not everything was easy. Loneliness pressed hard, and tempers occasionally flared in the close quarters. Quarrels erupted over letters, over conflicting memories, over unsettling rumors of what truly awaited them back in Germany. But even these moments deepened the paradox. Within the camp's fences, they argued like neighbors rather than prisoners. They had, in a profound sense, forged a fragile community, bound together by shared uncertainty and an unexpected discovery of dignity. A resilient humor of survival threaded through their days. They teased one another about their English accents, laughed at the endless meals of cornbread, and joked about how Americans seemed to put corn into absolutely everything. One woman, standing knee-deep in a field in Iowa, threw her hands up in mock surrender and declared, "If the war does not kill me, corn will." The guard beside her laughed, unable to help himself. It was a small moment, yet it chipped away at the walls both sides had so carefully constructed. And yet, beneath the laughter and the steady work, shadows stubbornly lingered. News filtered in from Europe, and each report further darkened the barracks. Cities flattened by relentless bombing, families irrevocably lost in the east, and the slow, grinding hunger that mercilessly devoured what little remained of the Reich. The women starkly compared these grim stories with the warm meals spread before them, and these comparisons carved out a new, terrifying fear. Freedom now meant abandoning the only place where they were consistently safe and fed. The internal conflict became increasingly visible as the months passed. Guards noticed tears during mail call, women clinging to letters as if to prevent the fragile paper from blowing away. One recalled seeing a prisoner stand silently for an hour at the fence line, staring westward as though trying to memorize the outline of the American horizon. It was not affection for the country that held her captive. It was profound dread of the one that waited beyond. The camps transformed into places of stark contradiction. Prisons that nourished, walls that protected rather than merely confined. The women themselves became contradictions, too. Soldiers without weapons, captives who feared release. Officers struggled desperately to make sense of it all. Why would anyone choose to remain behind wire rather than claim freedom? The answer grew clearer with each heartbreaking testimony. Because the world outside had utterly collapsed. In this profound paradox lay the heart of their story. They were not rejecting home. They were rejecting ruin. They were not embracing America. They were clinging to the last semblance of security. And as the officers prepared for the inevitable process of repatriation, the pleas began to surface. Some were whispered in broken English. Others scribbled onto scraps of paper, "Please let us stay." It was a truly strange plea for prisoners to make, one that deeply unsettled the officers who heard it. Captivity had become an unexpected refuge, and freedom had become a paralyzing fear. The irony was sharp, the kind that history seems almost too cruel to invent. The barbed wire, originally intended to divide and confine, had inexplicably become their shield. And soon, as orders for transport loomed closer, those shields would be stripped away. The women knew it. The guards suspected it. And what came next would test both sides in ways neither had ever expected. The first trains bound for the east stood ready in the summer of 1946, their iron wheels glinting ominously beneath the prairie sun. For the American officers, the task appeared straightforward. Repatriate the prisoners, as mandated by the Geneva Convention, and restore order by returning them to the soil of their homeland. But for the women who had endured a year or more behind the wire, the mere thought of stepping onto those trains filled them with a dread more potent than captivity itself. Letters from Europe had already meticulously painted the outlines of a nightmare. Hamburg was a city of scorched bricks. Dresden still smoldered, a monument to destruction. Cologne was described not as a city, but as a lunar landscape of shattered chimneys. Even the western zones, under British and American control, staggered under pervasive shortages. Families bartered cherished heirlooms for meager potatoes. Children fainted in schools from sheer hunger, and a woman might walk 10 miles for a single pound of flour. The prisoners knew these stories not from propaganda, but from the urgent ink of trembling hands, folded into envelopes that had miraculously reached them across the Atlantic. One 24-year-old Luftwaffe auxiliary named Hannelore read, aloud to her bunkmates, the words of her mother in Hanover. "Your sister is gone. Your father is missing. I sleep in the cellar because the roof has holes. If you return, I do not know where you will sleep." The letter crumpled in her grasp, but the palpable terror in her voice lingered long after the paper was folded away. Another woman utterly broke down upon learning her village had been consumed by the Soviet advance. She whispered to a guard in halting English, "My home does not exist." To the officers, going home was a pragmatic matter of logistics. To the women, it was a terrifying sentence to wander among ruins, begging for scraps. One camp commandant later admitted that these pleas unsettled him more profoundly than any act of defiance. It was, he confessed, easier to confront hatred than to contend with such overwhelming despair. Some women attempted official petitions, scrawling notes that desperately begged for extensions of their captivity or work contracts within the United States. Others resorted to more desperate appeals, volunteering as nurses in American hospitals or offering to clean barracks, anything simply to remain within the camp's protective perimeter. A few even inquired if they might marry their way into America, though regulations at the time rendered such requests impossible. What intensified this pervasive fear was the looming specter of the Soviet zone. Stories trickled into the camps of mass reprisals, of women dragged from cellars, of entire villages emptied in the dead of night. Even those destined for British or American sectors feared the uncertain journey eastward. The trains often deposited their passengers in temporary transit camps with little food and no certainty of where they would go next. A young woman named Lotte, once a secretary in Bremen, confided to a fellow prisoner that she would rather scrub floors in Texas for the rest of her life than risk a single night in the Soviet zone. Her words echoed among the bunks like a solemn vow, though all knew it was one she could not possibly keep. The irony struck many of the Americans who overheard these heart-wrenching conversations. They had been rigorously trained to view Germans as fanatical, loyal to Hitler until the bitter end. Instead, they encountered women who feared their own devastated country more than the barbed wire of their captors. A 19-year-old guard described it in a letter home. "They are afraid of freedom. Can you imagine? They cry when they think of going back. They say there is nothing left there, nothing to eat, nothing to live for. Some of them would rather be our prisoners forever." Even small, seemingly insignificant details of daily life relentlessly reinforced the vast chasm between America and Germany. A prisoner in Kansas marveled that she could wash with soap every week. Her sister in Frankfurt wrote that she had not bathed in months, water being too scarce and soap non-existent. In Oklahoma, women sang to the rhythm of accordion music. In Berlin, survivors huddled in cellars, listening to the groan of collapsing walls. These comparisons haunted them. Captivity, once universally feared, had become the only world where life held rhythm and nourishment. And yet, orders descended with bureaucratic precision. Trains would depart on schedule. Ships would ferry them across the Atlantic, and the U.S. Army would consider its responsibility discharged. In briefings, officers dutifully repeated the line that the women should be grateful for their release. Few, if any, truly considered what awaited them on the other side of the ocean. The women themselves tried to imagine it. Stepping off a ship into Bremerhaven, only to find strangers picking through the rubble where their childhood homes once stood. Would their mothers still be alive? Would their children, if any, even recognize them after so long? These questions pressed so heavily that many lay awake in the barracks, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the collective sighs of their neighbors, who also could not sleep. One night in Iowa, a ferocious storm lashed against the barracks, rain hammering the roof, wind rattling the shutters. Inside, the women huddled together, their voices hushed. They spoke not of hopeful homecomings, but of their most profound fears. "We will be forgotten," one whispered. Another murmured, "We will go back as beggars." A third whispered the darkest thought of all. "Better to stay a prisoner than to be free in ruins." Lightning cracked across the prairie, briefly illuminating their pale faces, and for a moment they looked less like captives than like exiles awaiting a terrible judgment. The Americans attempted to reassure them. A chaplain told the prisoners that rebuilding was indeed possible, that Germany would rise again. His words were sincere, but they carried no bread, no roof, no tangible safety. The women nodded politely, but afterward one confided to a friend, "It is easy to speak of rebuilding when your home is not ash." The sentence carried the profound weariness of a generation watching their entire country vanish beneath their feet. As departure neared, the women's demeanor visibly changed. They walked slower to roll call, lingered longer at the fences, stared longer at the receding American horizon they would soon leave behind. Some guards, hardened by long service, found themselves unexpectedly moved by the sight. One remembered a young woman tracing her finger along the barbed wire as if trying to memorize its feel. Her last anchor before being cast into utter uncertainty. "I thought prisons were supposed to hold people against their will," he wrote later. But these prisoners held on to the prison. The final days in camp were marked by an unspoken unease. Officially, it was liberation. In truth, it was a forced return to devastation. The women packed the few belongings they possessed. A scarf knitted in captivity, a photograph of a guard's child given in kindness, a notebook filled with diary entries about soap and corn and music. Each item felt heavier than the suitcase that carried it, because each represented a life about to vanish. When the trains finally whistled, the sound carried both a sense of relief and an overwhelming dread. The officers believed they were fulfilling their duty. The women felt they were stepping into exile. And as they climbed aboard, some with tears streaking their cheeks, the profound contradiction stood naked before history. Freedom offered and, in spirit, refused. For the gates of captivity were closing, but what waited beyond them was darker still, and soon the world would discover just how many begged not to be freed at all. The first trains pulled away from the camps with groaning wheels and columns of smoke. But what lingered most vividly in memory were not the departures themselves, but the faces pressed against the glass. American guards, hardened by years of war, later admitted they had expected joy, or at least a visible sense of relief, in the women's expressions. Instead, many looked utterly stricken, their eyes fixed on the barbed wire, which retreated into the distance as if they were being forcibly torn away from their last sanctuary. This paradox profoundly haunted the men who watched. These prisoners had arrived as enemies, yet they departed as reluctant exiles, clinging to captivity with a loyalty no one had imagined possible. For some women, the petitions to remain had been carefully written in neat script and nervously handed to officers. They asked to continue their work in camp kitchens, to scrub floors, to tend gardens, anything to stay in America, even if it meant embracing their current confinement. A daring few ventured to envision futures that transcended their prisoner status, futures woven into the very fabric of the land they had once been told to despise. Proposals ranged from marrying a guard to securing contracts as domestic workers, seeking a life rooted in the country that had been depicted as the enemy. While formal regulations rendered these petitions impossible, their very articulation illuminated a profound shift in perspective. Captivity no longer registered as a punitive burden. Instead, it had transformed into a protective bastion against a world utterly shattered. American officers grappling with these appeals found themselves wrestling with a deep sense of bewilderment. A captain stationed in Kansas later recounted his utter confusion. "We told them they were free, and they begged for their chains." For him, freedom was an inherent, absolute human desire, the natural aspiration of any captive soul. Yet, these women had arrived at a vastly different understanding, perceiving freedom not as the mere unlatching of a gate, but as the tangible assurance of safety, sustenance, and respect. These paradoxically precious guarantees, they realized, lay not in a devastated Germany, but within the secured confines of the American Midwest's internment camps. This unusual allegiance to their confined existence was not born of any burgeoning patriotism for America. While a few women confessed a nascent affection for its expansive skies, the seemingly boundless fields of corn, or the melodies of jazz and swing occasionally wafting from distant town radios, their deepest devotion was to survival itself. Within the protective perimeter of the wire, they had rediscovered the fundamental meaning of warmth, regular meals, and being treated with basic human dignity. A stark contrast to their former status as mere burdens in a famine-stricken, war-torn homeland. Years later, one former prisoner articulated this stark truth with poignant clarity. "In America, I was a prisoner, but in Germany, I would have been nothing." Yet, the grand narrative of history rarely bends for individual exceptions. The Geneva Convention unequivocally compelled the United States to enact repatriation, and the immense machinery of war bureaucracy began to move with an unstoppable, impersonal force. Soon, shiploads of prisoners were steaming eastward, back to the ravaged ports of Bremerhaven and Hamburg. There, on somber, gray docks, families or complete strangers awaited, some clutching fragile slips of paper bearing names, others simply standing in silent vigil, their eyes hollow with unspoken loss. The women, stepping off the gangplanks, were absorbed into a homeland utterly transformed, its streets scorched, its houses gaping and roofless, its people skeletal. For those who had so desperately pleaded to stay in America, their direst premonitions about their shattered nation were chillingly confirmed. Still, the experience of captivity had etched itself onto their psyches in ways that proved enduring. Once resettled, a significant number of these women began to harbor a profound longing to return, not to the barbed wire itself, but to the nation that had, against all expectations, treated them with unexpected kindness. By the 1950s, as opportunities for immigration to the United States reopened through special visa programs, some of these former prisoners eagerly submitted applications. A fortunate handful eventually succeeded, embarking on the transatlantic journey once more, this time not as prisoners of war, but as hopeful immigrants seeking the very land where they had first encountered the surprising possibility of survival. Their scattered narratives, preserved in oral histories and family archives, bear witness to a peculiar, compelling truth. The memory of their captivity had, against all logic, evolved into a bridge leading to a sense of belonging. For those who ultimately remained in Germany, the period of captivity lingered in their memories as a season both deeply bitter and strangely imbued with a bittersweet glow. They recounted the profound shame of national defeat, the personal humiliation of being held under guard. Yet, alongside these painful recollections were vivid memories of unexpectedly generous meals, often too abundant to finish, of shared laughter over attempts at clumsy English phrases, and of late-night songs that echoed softly into the vast prairie air. These inherent contradictions did not negate each other. Rather, they coexisted within their consciousness, profoundly shaping a generation of women who had learned that true freedom was seldom a simple state, and that captivity, in unexpected circumstances, was not always an entirely cruel one. The Americans, too, found themselves irrevocably altered by these encounters. Guards who had initially regarded their prisoners with suspicion, fear, or even disdain, carried home indelible stories of women weeping inconsolably at the prospect of their release. Decades later, one sergeant confided in his children, "I saw the enemy ask to stay my prisoner. That's when I understood how broken their world was." For him, the enduring memory was not one of military triumph, but of profound human tragedy, the heart-wrenching image of young women clinging to prison fences as if those wires represented their very lifelines. Even within the seemingly restrictive environment of the camps, the women's loyalty to their captivity took on a quiet, almost sacred dimension. They meticulously maintained their living quarters, cultivated small patches of flowers outside the barracks, and assiduously created order in spaces where such efforts were technically unrequired. It was as though they intuitively understood that for as long as the fences stood, they could meticulously carve out a fragile sense of dignity, fostering a resilient community of survival. To venture beyond those protective fences, they knew, meant relinquishing all of this, abandoning their carefully constructed haven for a homeland where even the basic necessities of shelter and food had become unimaginable luxuries. The barbed wire, originally a stark symbol of brutal oppression, had, through this profound shift in perspective, transmuted into the very outline of their sanctuary. This poignant historical narrative is replete with ironies too profound to overlook. American officers, convinced that freedom was the ultimate gift they could bestow, were compelled to witness their prisoners recoil from it in genuine terror. German women, who had once lived under a regime that grandly promised 1,000 years of glory, now desperately clung to the daily mercies offered by a foreign adversary. For them, freedom had come to signify hunger and devastation, while captivity, remarkably, represented survival. History undeniably revels in such paradoxes, but few cut as deeply or reveal as much about the human condition as this one. And so the narrative ultimately circles back to those fateful words uttered in 1945. "You can go home." Intended as a pronouncement of liberation, a key to open a new door, for countless women, it resonated instead like a heavy sentence. In the ensuing years, some managed to painstakingly rebuild lives within Germany's ruins. Others departed again as swiftly as circumstances allowed, pursuing the lingering echo of the country where, for the first time in years, they had experienced genuine security. Their profound loyalty to captivity stemmed less from an affection for America than from a primal desperation, the ingrained human instinct to cleave to safety wherever it might manifest. Even today, the image remains profoundly vivid. Women standing at the very edge of the wire, their gaze fixed not eastward toward Europe, but westward toward the distant horizon, a land they could not claim, yet could never erase from their memories. Their loyalty to captivity was, in essence, an unwavering loyalty to life itself. It serves as a powerful reminder that freedom is never merely the absence of physical chains, but fundamentally encompasses the presence of dignity, safety, and hope. And as the final gates clanged shut, with the ships already waiting to carry them home, a haunting question lingered in the air, thick and persistent like smoke over a battlefield. What did home truly mean to those who no longer recognized the shattered reality that awaited them?